The air inside the wooden council house was thick with the scent of sweat, tobacco, and candle smoke. The low murmur of voices barely masked the tension rippling through the room. On one side of the long, scarred table sat Colonel Jacob Henshaw, his weathered hands clasped in front of him, knuckles white. Opposite him, Chief Tahuka of the Comanche sat still as stone, his dark eyes unreadable. The flickering lamplight cast jagged shadows across his sharp features, the deep lines around his mouth carved by years of war and loss. Behind the colonel, men armed with rifles leaned against the walls, their fingers twitching near triggers, distrust coiling in their shoulders. The Comanche warriors flanking their chief mirrored the tension, their faces impassive but their bodies alert, coiled like panthers waiting to strike. Between them lay the fragile remnants of a peace treaty, one already stained with the blood of past betrayals. Tahuka's voice, deep and measured, cut through the silence. Your people speak of peace, yet they build walls, dig trenches, and push farther into our land. Henshaw exhaled through his nose, shifting in his seat. We don't seek more war, Chief. Enough men have died on both sides. He let the weight of his words settle before he continued. We need a way to seal this peace, a bond that can't be broken by greed or bloodlust. Tahuka did not respond immediately. He had seen too many agreements crumble, too many handshakes turned to rifle fire, and yet his people could not endure another winter of war. He had lost warriors, sons, and now he sat across from men who had once ordered his kind shot on sight, speaking of peace as if the past had not been etched in blood. The colonel leaned forward. A marriage. The word hovered in the air like a vulture circling a dying animal. Tahuka's warriors stiffened. He felt the weight of their stares, felt his own breath deepen as the meaning behind the proposal sank in. My daughter, Henshaw pressed on, his voice a knife cutting through the thick silence. Julia. At the far end of the room, a sharp intake of breath drew every eye. Julia Henshaw stood in the doorway, her fingers curling into fists at her sides. She had not been invited to this meeting, had not even been told of the colonel's plan. She had come only to confront him about the whispers in town, but now the truth was out, and it crashed over her like a flood. Her father's gaze locked onto her, warning her to stay silent. But Julia was not the type to hold her tongue. You would sell me off like a piece of cattle, she spat, her voice trembling with fury. To a man I do not know, to people I have been raised to fear. Henshaw's jaw clenched. This isn't about you, Julia. It's about preventing war. Tahuka watched her with quiet intensity. She was small compared to the warriors in the room, but there was fire in her, defiance that reminded him of the Comanche women who stood unshaken even in the face of death. She had the look of someone who had spent her life fighting against expectations, though she likely never imagined this battle. Julia turned her glare toward him. And you? Would you take a wife forced into this union? A woman who would rather run into the wild and face wolves than share your bed? Tahuka's expression did not change, but his gaze did not waver. A marriage for peace is not a marriage of the heart, he said, his voice calm, deliberate. It is a duty, one I will accept if it means no more of my people will die. She let out a bitter laugh. So that's it, I am duty. Henshaw stood, his chair scraping against the wooden floor. It is decided. Julia's breath hitched. I have a say in this. No, her father interrupted. You do not. The finality in his voice sent ice down her spine. He had made up his mind long before she entered the room. The marriage was arranged for the following evening. The sun dipped low over the plains, casting the Comanche camp in hues of copper and gold. The ceremony was sparse, no celebration, no joy. Julia stood stiffly, wrapped in a simple linen dress, her blonde hair loose around her shoulders. Beside her, Tahuka was silent, his expression unreadable. He had donned his finest deerskin, his long hair bound with beads of turquoise and bone. The elders spoke the words that bound them, voices deep and measured, ancient traditions pressed into a moment neither of them had chosen. When it was done, a blanket was draped over their shoulders, symbolizing unity. Julia felt the weight of it, but there was no warmth in the gesture. No one cheered, no one smiled. The settlers had already begun drinking, a handful toasting to peace, with hollow laughter and cheap whiskey. The Comanche remained watchful, their silence louder than the revelry. Julia's heart pounded as she turned toward the waiting horses. She had tried to steel herself for this moment, but dread clawed at her throat. This was not just a marriage, it was an exile. She was leaving behind everything she had ever known, riding into a world where she was unwanted. Tahuka mounted his horse, looking down at her. When she hesitated, he extended his hand. For a moment she stared at it, refusing the gesture out of sheer defiance. Then, with a deep breath, she took it. His grip was strong, steady, but it did not feel like comfort. It felt like a chain snapping into place. The journey began in silence. The Comanche warriors moved like shadows through the land, their horses swift and tireless. Julia struggled to match their pace, her fingers clenching the reins until her knuckles ached. The further they rode from the settlement, the smaller it became in the distance, until it was nothing but a smudge against the horizon. She swallowed against the lump in her throat. There was no turning back. Hours passed. The wind whispered through, the tall grass carrying the scent of earth and rain. The vast open land stretched endlessly before her, and for the first time she understood just how far from home she truly was. Her horse stumbled on uneven ground, and she barely caught herself before falling. A curse slipped from her lips, but before she could right herself, a firm hand closed around her wrist. Tahuka was beside her, steadying her without a word. She yanked her arm free. "I don't need your help." His gaze held hers, steady, unwavering. "Then ride better." Julia's temper flared, but before she could snap back, he spurred his horse forward. She bit the inside of her cheek, swallowed her pride, and forced herself to keep up. The night grew colder. The stars blinked overhead, distant and indifferent. They stopped to rest in a secluded valley, the air thick with the scent of damp earth. The Comanche warriors spoke quietly amongst themselves, their voices low and melodic. Julia sat apart, her arms wrapped around herself, watching the fire flicker. Tahuka approached, offering her a blanket. She hesitated, staring at the woven fabric as though it were a trick. "You will freeze," he said simply. She took it, though her fingers trembled slightly. As she draped it over her shoulders, she caught his gaze across the fire. He was studying her, not with cruelty, but with something else, something unreadable. She held his stare for a long moment before turning away. She did not know what tomorrow would bring, but one thing was certain. This was only the beginning. The sky stretched endlessly overhead, an expanse of muted greys and bruised purples as the sun dipped beyond the western ridges. The wind carried the scent of damp earth, rolling over the land like a restless ghost. Julia's legs ached from riding, her fingers raw from gripping the reins too tightly, but she refused to complain. If she showed weakness, she feared what little ground she had gained in these silent, watchful days would be lost. Tahuka rode. Ahead, his posture relaxed yet alert, his dark hair shifting with each gust of wind. He rarely spoke, but when he did, his words were sharp and purposeful. She had learned to watch him, to read the slight shifts in his body language. When his shoulders stiffened, it meant something unseen stirred in the distance. When he slowed, his horse, the others, did the same without question. He was a leader, and though she resented the life she had been forced into, she could not deny his quiet command over his people. The Comanche warriors had kept their distance since their departure from the settlement, their gazes unreadable, their acceptance of her reluctant at best. The only one who occasionally acknowledged her presence was Takaani, an older woman who rode near the center of the group, her dark eyes filled with something close to pity. The land was nothing like the world she had grown up in. There were no fences, no roads, no signs of the order and structure that the settlers clung to. Here nature reigned vast and untamed, with rolling plains that bled into jagged canyons and distant mountains. Julia had never felt so small. The storm came swiftly. The wind shifted first, sudden and sharp, cutting through the growing dusk with a bitter chill. Tahuka pulled his horse to a halt, lifting his chin toward the heavy clouds rolling in from the west. "We make camp here," he said, his voice barely carrying over the rising wind. The others obeyed without question, moving with practiced efficiency as they dismounted and began gathering what little dry wood they could find. Julia hesitated, unsure of what to do, before following their lead. She crouched beside Takani, mimicking her as she arranged kindling beneath the stacked branches. Her fingers fumbled, unskilled, but she pushed forward, determined not to appear useless. A rumble of thunder rolled across the land, low and threatening. The wind picked up, lashing against her exposed skin, tearing at her dress. She clenched her jaw and tried again, striking the flint against the steel Takani had handed her. Sparks danced but failed to catch. Tahuka crouched beside her without a word. His hands, scarred from years of battle, moved with ease as he adjusted the wood, sheltering it from the wind. He struck the flint once, twice, then fire flickered to life. Small and fragile. Julia swallowed the bitter taste of frustration. "You rely too much on force," he said, his voice calm. "Fire does not answer to strength, it answers to patience." She hated how easily he could see through her. The rain came in heavy sheets, forcing them to retreat beneath an overhang of rock. The flames sputtered and died, plunging them into near darkness. Julia shivered, her dress soaked through, her fingers numb. Without a word, Tahuka pulled a blanket from his saddle and draped it over her shoulders. She flinched at the gesture, at the unexpected kindness. Their eyes met briefly in the dim light, and for a moment she saw something there, an acknowledgement perhaps, not understanding, not yet, but something less than hostility. She clutched the blanket tighter and turned away. When the storm passed, they rode again, the ground soft and treacherous beneath their horses. The air smelled clean, the world around them reborn under the washed-out light of dawn. The silence between them remained, but it had changed. It was no longer weighted by resentment alone. The journey was slow, the terrain growing harsher with each passing mile. Julia learned to adapt, to move with the rhythm of the horse instead of against it, to watch the land as Tahuka did, searching for signs of danger. It came sooner than she expected. The first howl drifted through the still air like a whisper. Of death. The Comanche warriors reacted instantly, their hands moving to their weapons, their horses shifting uneasily beneath them. Tahuka's expression did not change, but his posture did. He was listening, waiting. Another howl. Closer. Julia's throat went dry. Wolves. Tahuka turned to her. "Stay close." The pack emerged from the tall grass like ghosts, their eyes glinting in the fading light. They were lean, desperate, their ribs pressing against matted fur. The lead wolf let out a low growl, lips curling over yellowed teeth. The horses stomped and huffed, restless. Then, like a shadow breaking, the first wolf lunged. Tahuka moved faster than she thought possible, his knife flashing as he slashed at the beast, sending it yelping back into the dark. Another leapt toward her horse, and she barely managed to stay in the saddle as it snapped at her boot. The warriors fought without hesitation, their movements precise, controlled. Arrows flew, knives found their mark. Julia's breath came in sharp, uneven gasps. Her heart slammed against her ribs. She reached for the small blade Takani had given her and gripped it tightly, though she had no idea what she would do with it. The wolves hesitated, sensing their disadvantage. Blood stained the ground. Their leader growled, then turned sharply, disappearing into the night. The others followed, vanishing as swiftly as they had come. The silence that followed was deafening. Julia's hands shook. She felt sick. Tahuka approached her, his own breathing steady despite the adrenaline still coursing through the group. His gaze swept over her, assessing. "You are not hurt." It was not a question, but a statement. She shook her head, unable to find her voice. He studied her for a moment longer, then nodded. "Good." Then he walked away as if nothing had happened. She watched him, something unreadable twisting in her chest. By the time they reached the Comanche village, the land had shifted. The open plains gave way to rolling hills, scattered with trees and winding streams. Smoke curled from distant fires, and the sound of voices, dozens of them, carried on the breeze. The warriors were met with cautious eyes. Children peeked from behind their mothers' skirts. Men regarded her with thinly veiled mistrust. Julia straightened her spine, refusing to shrink beneath their scrutiny. Tahuka dismounted first, then turned to her. This was it. The point of no return. She hesitated only for a moment before swinging her leg over the saddle, landing on unsteady feet. The village watched in silence. Then, without a word, Tahuka turned and walked toward the largest lodge, the fabric of his tunic brushing against her as he passed. He did not check to see if she would follow. He already knew she would. The village stirred at dawn, voices rising with the crackling of early fires. Smoke coiled into the cold morning air as warriors prepared for the hunt, their horses restless and eager. Julia watched from a distance, standing at the edge of the lodge she now shared with Tahuka. Though weeks had passed since her arrival, she still felt the weight of eyes on her, the unspoken judgment of those who saw her as an outsider. Tahuka emerged from the lodge, his expression unreadable as always. His presence had become familiar to her, his quiet strength something she no longer feared but respected. He moved with purpose, every step deliberate, every glance carrying meaning. She had come to understand that his silence was not coldness but control. A commotion near the entrance of the village drew his attention. A rider, dust-streaked and breathless, galloped in, his horse lathered with sweat. The air shifted as the village gathered, an unspoken tension settling over them like a storm cloud. Tahuka stepped forward, his voice calm but commanding. Warrior slid from his horse, panting. "Settlers," he said in Comanche. "They raided our hunting party, 5 dead. They left their bodies to rot." A chill ran through Julia's spine. Murmurs spread like wildfire. The warriors gripped their weapons, fury smoldering in their eyes. Takani muttered a curse under her breath, her fingers tightening around the beads she wore. Tahuka did not move at first, but Julia could see the way his jaw clenched, the slight shift in his stance. "Who?" he asked. The warrior hesitated, then, reluctantly, "Colonel Henshaw's men." The world tilted. Julia's breath caught in her throat, her stomach twisting into knots. "No," she whispered. Tahuka turned his gaze to her, but his expression did not soften. His eyes, dark and unreadable, held hers for a long moment. Then he spoke, his voice low and steady. "We ride at sunset." The village erupted in a flurry of movement. Warriors prepared their bows, checked their rifles, and tightened the leather straps of their saddles. The scent of burning sage filled the air. Prayers whispered under breath as they made ready for war. Julia moved through the chaos, her heart pounding. She found Tahuka near the corral, tightening the reins on his horse. "You can't do this," she said, her voice sharp, desperate. He did not look at her. "Your people broke the treaty." "Not my people," she shot back. "Not all of them, you know that." Finally he turned, his gaze heavy with something she couldn't place. "You would defend them after what they did?" She swallowed hard. "I would stop. This before more people die." The wind whispered between them. For a long moment neither spoke. Then, without another word, Tahuka mounted his horse and rode toward the waiting warriors. Julia watched him disappear into the gathering dusk, fear curling around her ribs like a vice. The attack came before dawn. Julia woke to the sound of gunfire, to the screams of women and the thunder of hooves. The settlers had come first. The village was in chaos. Warriors rushed to defend their home, arrows flying through the air, blades clashing in the flickering firelight. Smoke burned Julia's lungs as she stumbled from the lodge, her heart slamming. Against her ribs, a figure loomed in the darkness, Colonel Henshaw. Her father's face was drawn tight, his eyes wild. He gripped a rifle in one hand, his coat stained with dust and sweat. Behind him, settlers moved like ghosts through the smoke, rifles raised, cutting down anything in their path. "Julia," he breathed, stepping toward her. "Come, now." She took a step back. "No." A flicker of something, confusion, disbelief, crossed his face. "You don't belong here," he said, voice strained. "These savages don't," she snapped, anger burning through her fear. "Don't say that. Don't pretend you didn't start this war." His jaw tightened. I'm taking you home. She shook her head. This is my home now. The words surprised even her, but they rang true. Before he could respond, a gunshot split the air to Tahuka. He moved through the battlefield like a shadow, cutting down men with ruthless precision. His gaze found hers across the chaos, and something in his expression changed. Relief, fear, anger. Then he saw Henshaw. Julia barely had time to react before Tahuka charged forward. Henshaw raised his rifle, but he was too slow. Tahuka tackled him to the ground, his blade pressing against the colonel's throat. Henshaw struggled, but Tahuka was stronger, faster. For a moment time stood still. Julia took a shaky breath. Don't. Tahuka didn't move. His muscles were tense, his breathing ragged. He is not worth your soul, she whispered. Slowly, Tahuka eased back. He did not sheath his blade, but he did not strike. Instead he spoke, his voice quiet but firm. Leave, and do not return. Henshaw's eyes burned with hatred, but he knew he had lost. He staggered to his feet, spitting. Blood onto the dirt. This isn't over, he growled. Then he was gone, vanishing into the smoke and the chaos. The settlers retreated soon after, their numbers too few to stand against the Comanche warriors. By the time the sun rose, the village stood, battered but unbroken. Julia found Tahuka near the river, washing the blood from his hands. You didn't kill him, she said softly. He did not look at her. Not for his sake. She hesitated, then stepped closer. Then for whose? A long silence stretched between them. Finally, he met her gaze. For yours. Something inside her cracked open. She had hated him once, feared him, resented him. But now, standing before him, she saw him for what he truly was, not just a warrior. Not just the man forced into marriage by war, a man who had chosen mercy when vengeance would have been easier, a man she no longer hated. The wind shifted, carrying the scent of damp earth and smoke. The past could not be undone. But perhaps the future had yet to be written, and for the first time she did not fear it.